Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to welcome you and to welcome Kai back home, so to speak. This is where he went to college. Marketplace, as well as the Marketplace Morning Report, are really two of the strongest programs in our lineup, and we are so proud to bring them to you. And we're so glad to welcome you here, and we appreciate you supporting the station and supporting us. Marketplace is known for looking at business and economics sideways, giving the news a fresh slant, so to speak. And that's what Kai is bringing as the new host of the show. Kai Ryssdal took the reins as host of Marketplace in August of this year, and he is not the same person that was in the role before. We were talking this morning at our table about how there are some similarities in the way that the three hosts have sounded in the past, but we promise you he is new to this post, and we're excited to have him in it. He previously hosted the Marketplace Morning Report for more than 4 years. Before joining Marketplace, Kai was a reporter and a substitute host for a program called the California Report, which is a news and information program distributed to public radio stations throughout California by KQED Public Radio in San Francisco. Kai grew up in Westchester County, New York, where he lived with his parents and his younger brother. Then it was off to Emory University, where he majored in history. After graduating from Emory, here in Atlanta, Kai spent 8 years in the United States Navy, first flying from the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt. And then he worked as a Pentagon staff officer before his career began in public radio. And he's only been in radio, he says, for about 7 years. It sounds like much longer than that. He's quite the pro. Kai was a member also of the United States Foreign Service, and he served in Ottawa, Canada, and Beijing, China, among other places. It's interesting that Kai hosts Marketplace. As he says, he's not a business guy. But then again, no one at Marketplace really is. Kai says that's what lets them speak English about the economy and the news. Some of his favorite stories at Marketplace are those with an interesting twist or a hint of fun, such as a piece on the economics of exotic dancing. Kai is married, and he is the father of 3 boys, and we are so excited to welcome Kai back to Atlanta. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kai Ryssdal.
I'm pretty sure I turned it on. Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for coming out in the rain. I noticed it's actually getting worse, so I apologize for that on your drives to the office. First of all, let me say thank you for having me. It is an extraordinary pleasure to be back here in Atlanta. It has been 20 years since I have been in any part of Atlanta, and I have to tell you, I just don't recognize the place. All this stuff behind me wasn't there. It wasn't there. We used to come to parties in Piedmont Park and have a great time, but none of it was there. So it is truly an extraordinary pleasure for me to be here. Before I actually get going, let me just mention something that John spoke about when he was giving you the legal disclaimer of this morning's events. He said, everybody who asks a question is consenting to be recorded because we have to get the best parts of this on the tape. And the best parts of this are not what I'm going to talk about. The best parts of this are the questions that you guys ask and the conversations that we have. This is no fun for me if I just stand up here and talk. Nobody's really interested in hearing it. But let's have a dialogue, and if you want to raise your hand and ask me a question, go ahead, and we'll just talk about it. Coming out to stations, and I'm actually going out to WAB at lunchtime. Coming out to stations is, for me, the best part of this job. It lets me get out and talk to real people and get out of the studio where it's just me and a microphone and talk about things that people are really interested in, that they want to hear on the radio, that they have heard on the radio. The thing about it, though, is that every time I come out to a station, I am reminded with a great deal of chagrin of the very first time that I sat in front of a live microphone at KQED doing the afternoon news. I had been at the station for about 18 months or so, and the afternoon anchor was sick or whatever happened, and they came to me in a panic at 2:15 in the afternoon and said, listen, there's a newscast at 4:30. Can you do it? And I said, yeah, I mean, of course I can. Sure. So I busily write my cast, and I go into the studio a little bit early, and I practice, and everything's great. And I'm sitting there, and the 4:30 NPR afternoon newscast comes on, and Ann Taylor does her thing, and then at 4:33:17 she says, this is Ann Taylor, NPR News in Washington. And I pick up my papers, and I'm sitting there like this, very ready to go on the air. And I say, and in San Francisco, this is Kai Ryssdal, KQED Radio News. And I take that page that says it, and I put it aside. And all the other papers go like this. And it sounds not unlike this on the radio. Okay? And so I'm sitting there going like this, trying to get these papers, and the engineer is talking to me in my ear saying, yes, and I'm sort of doing one of these, reading the news as I'm making it up and I'm pulling these things up. And I finally get through my newscast. And I'm coming to the end, and it's 4:33, 4:44, 4:45. The time is ticking by endlessly. And I get to my out cue, and my out cue is place, name, time, right? You hear your standard out cues. Leah can back me up on this. And I say, in San Francisco, this is Kai Ryssdal, it is, and I look up at the digital clock and I say, it is, and it's right there, and it says 4:36:50, and I can't read the clock. So my engineer mercifully turns off the microphone. I slump in my chair and make my way horribly slowly out of the studio. And I get back to my desk. And I sit down, and as I sit down, my phone is ringing. And I pick up the phone and I say, KQED, Radio News, Kai Ryssdal. And my wife says, sweetie, I think that was all right. I think there was a little bobble, but I don't think it was a big problem. And then she says, listen, can you tell me what time it is? It's my wife. The perils of a live microphone until you discover that it is actually your friend are quite fraught, one might say. I made my way, as I guess is apparent, from KQED and that not very auspicious beginning to Marketplace, where I think I have finally found my home in radio. We were talking a little bit at breakfast about when David Brancaccio left the program a couple of years ago. And he said, this is the best job in broadcast journalism, bar none. And I can't think of a reason to change that. There is nothing I would rather do in radio than host a program like Marketplace with the freedom we have and the ability we have to take what is, in all honesty, but if you repeat this, I'll deny it, can be a very boring subject. I mean, nobody's really interested in leading economic indicators. I mean, nobody's interested in that stuff. Neither am I. But the ability and the opportunity to take that and translate it into something that means something to listeners and to our audience is really a very special thing. I was sitting on the airplane yesterday, waiting to take off. Delta, Flight 292, LAX to Atlanta. And I had an interesting thought. I was sitting there and we were rolling on takeoff right on time, 7:07 in the morning Los Angeles time. And it occurred to me that this is an airline where everything was working right. We were on time, plane was loaded, staff was professional, stewardesses were great, captain was saying all the right things, had a great experience in the lounge before taking off. Everything was great. Plane was perfectly maintained. And it occurred to me that it was a remarkable thing that was happening because Delta Airlines, along with a couple of others in this country, as I'm sure all of you know, is an airline that has no money. Not a dime. 3-4 weeks ago, they declared bankruptcy, said we can't do it anymore. I was talking to David Johnson about this, our stockbroker and business guy down in Dallas. I was talking to him, actually it wound up on the air on Friday, you might have heard it. We were talking about airlines sort of as a larger paradigm for the entire economy and the turning point that David and I think we're at. Delta Airlines and all these other airlines are paying $125 a barrel for Jet A, for jet fuel. Now we're paying, I don't know what, $64, $65 for regular oil, but once it gets refined, Delta Airlines has to pay $125 for every barrel of it they buy. Airlines are letting their planes sit on the ground because they're losing less money that way than flying them and using gas, even with a full airplane. It is absolutely a crazy time in this economy. It is a great time to be covering this economy because things happen so fast and are so in-depth and are so involved in what it is that we all do every day that it just keeps everything interesting. Back to the Delta story for just a second. As we knew it was going to, it filed for bankruptcy middle of the afternoon-ish, Los Angeles time. It was actually 1:58 in the afternoon, Los Angeles time, that the flash came across the Associated Press wires that Delta had filed for bankruptcy. The problem was that at 1:58 in the afternoon, Los Angeles time, I'm going on the air at 2, and this is the news story of the day, right? Delta and Northwest almost simultaneously filing bankruptcy. I'm sitting in the studio doing an engineering check with our engineers. Everything sounds fine. I look down at my Reuters screen and my Associated Press screen, and there it is. Urgent. Delta Files Chapter 11. So here's what we did. I called Sherry Glazer, who was on the air yesterday afternoon, has been on the air many times for us, one of our most experienced and one of our least flappable reporters. 1:59:30, going on the air in 30 seconds. I picked up the studio phone and I said, Sherry, we're going to get this story on the radio in about 20 minutes. You need to sit down and write 50 seconds. We're going on the air, ready to go. I hung up the phone. Sherry sat down, cranked out 50 seconds of copy with a phone call in the middle to talk to the analyst to see what this really means. Cranked out 50 seconds of copy in 15 minutes, got it on the air, came and sat with me in the studio, which doesn't really happen. When I go in the studio, it's me and a bunch of tape from the control booth, right? I'm in there live. Most of the rest of the program is on tape. Parenthetically, my mother thought, until I got on the radio, my mother thought that it was all live and we were all standing in the studio. Sherry came in and sat with me and did what we call a live mix to air, which is, in radio terms, Leah helped me out here, not unlike doing a tight wire act without a net. Because what you want is a seamless transition from host to reporter, which works very nicely when it's a piece of tape that the reporter's doing. But when the reporter's in there with her adrenaline going and with having had 15 minutes to craft a sophisticated minute-long piece of tape on the business story of the day, and arguably the business story of the year, the airlines, I believe, it is a very tricky act. That's what we get to do, though, at Marketplace. We get to break all that stuff down, and we get to tell you about it. We start our days in Los Angeles at 8 o'clock in the morning. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab some water. Thanks. I got it. We start our days at 8 o'clock in the morning. And that day, the Delta file, we had said at the meeting, could be today. Who knows? And we had people thinking about it. We take a quick scan of the business pages. We talk to our staff reporters in New York and Los Angeles and Washington and London and Beijing, and we figure out what the stories of the day are. We spend some time going around that table in the morning because, as Leah said, none of us are business people. I've taken one economics course in my life when I was in graduate school. And I'm strangely proud of that because it is, I think, that lets me understand what it is that you guys need to hear. Because if I can't understand what I'm saying on the radio, chances are good that you're not going to understand what I'm saying on the radio, and that's no fun for anybody. We take our best shot at Marketplace. We take our best shot with complicated, intrinsically dry, not always scintillating subject matter and topics, and we try to bring it home. After that 8 o'clock meeting wraps up, we spend a lot of time doing interviews. I spend a lot of time doing interviews. The reporters spend a lot of time reporting their story, although they really only have 3.5 hours to get the program on the air. And at 2 o'clock in Los Angeles time, I'm standing in the studio, the gong goes, and I get to say, this is Marketplace. Let me just briefly tell you what's coming up on the program so you have something to look forward to, and then maybe we can all talk, because that's a lot more fun for the rest of us. 24th of October. That week, we are taking the program to New York. I'll be live on the floor of the stock exchange at 5 o'clock that afternoon, East Coast time. The markets will have closed, but we will be live on the stock exchange floor for that Monday. We'll be broadcasting from WNYC in New York for the remaining 4 days of the week. And we are going to take the program to the financial capital of the world, arguably where it should have been all along, but we can talk about that later if you want. I think some people will probably be curious as to why we haven't been there. After we get back from New York, I'm going to take a week to rest. And then I'm going to China for a week of reporting for a 2-week China special that we're doing the first 2 weeks of January. We're taking all 3 Marketplace shows, Marketplace Money, Marketplace at the Afternoon program, and the Marketplace Morning Report. I'll be hosting them all from Shanghai and Chongqing, China. After I come back from China, we're going to take a really long rest and figure out where we're going to go next. I think it's not inconceivable that we could spend a week here and a week in Chicago and a week in San Francisco. I think you're going to see a lot more from the program. You're going to hear a lot more from the program as we take it out and really go around this country and around the world and bring things home to the listeners and to the supporters of public radio like you all. And I do appreciate you coming. Any questions? Nothing's off game. Nothing's off limits. You can, whatever you like. Harriet will go first.
Just to start off, your last remark almost. What would it take to be sure that Marketplace comes to Atlanta for 2 days?
Call my boss, J.J. Yor. That's J. Yor at Minonkin. Here's what it'll take. I think, obviously, there are some places that are clearly we have to go. Have to go to New York. We have to go to Chicago. Think about Chicago. Marketplace has no presence in Chicago. You don't hear anything out of Chicago on Marketplace. We're working to fix that. I think we have to go to San Francisco. There's a case to be made that we have to go to Charlotte, North Carolina, right? And there is equally as good a case to be made that we have to come to Atlanta. I will make it. I'll be happy to make it. Anybody who has any thoughts, come up and see me, because I would love to bring the program here. It's not something you hear every day. A business program, a national business program coming out of the city and this state.
Thank you for being here. 2 questions, one related to something you said, one not. China, going to China. Recently, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial or a piece about China and some breaking down the tariffs and how many parties thought that would be just death in the other Asian countries in the textile trade, but instead of death, they all blossomed and the whole economy has grown. What do you think about that and the future impact of China on world trade?
Oof. Well, the second part of that question is a toughie, and I'll probably duck it. But let me give you the answer to the first part. Just by way of background, there was a global tariff agreement, quota agreement on textiles that expired the 1st of January that limited textile imports to developed nations from, I apologize for talking about tariffs at 8 o'clock in the morning, from developing countries to developed countries. When that agreement expired, Chinese textile exports to this country and to the European Union exploded. And I say that with full recognition of what that word means. Thousands of percentage increases in the number of textiles, Chinese textiles, coming to this country and to Western Europe. The feeling was that other textile industries in Thailand and Vietnam and Japan and Indonesia would suffer because of the growth in the Chinese market. But what has actually happened and what is happening is the European Union and China and the United States and China are negotiating, or have negotiated in the case of the European Union, new limits on those textiles. So that what is in fact happening is that textile industries in the rest of Southeast Asia are in fact growing. It's a little bit counterintuitive because nobody really thought that would happen. Nobody thought that the United States and the Chinese and the Europeans would agree on reimposing some of those limits. So I think actually this is a case of perhaps where tariffs being lifted and then the consequent effects of them have perhaps helped industries in Southeast Asia. To the second part of the question. That's why we're going to China. 30 years ago, Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious. And the Chinese people have taken that and run with it. I lived in Beijing in 1996 and 1997. And I bet my experience when I go back there in November will be much like it was at Emory on campus and standing here in Midtown today. I will not recognize it. It is the fastest growing economy in the world. It is the largest consumer of steel and concrete in the world. Something like 40% of all the world's containers, those big shipping boxes that go on container ships, are either in transit to or coming back from China. It is a story that we cannot not do. It will be, in 20 years, the biggest economy in the world. Your children and my children will be dealing with China not as a nuclear power and a military power, although it may well be, but perhaps even more significantly as an economic power. And that's something I don't think we've really thought about yet. And maybe when I come back in January, we will have had 2 weeks on Marketplace to think about.
Thank you. This gentleman behind me is calling up, and please do that as others might have comments. So
sure.
The second question, the thing you speak about was the hurricane devastation on the Gulf Coast, and particularly New Orleans. I wonder what you think would happen if it were only private money that would be used to redevelop that area.
Very interesting. I did an interview on the program not long after Katrina hit on that very subject. It was a guy, I forget his name, forgive me, but he had done redevelopment work in Kobe, Japan, after the earthquake there a number of years ago. His case was that it can't be only private money, because we, as a country, and you can form your own opinions on this, but we need to have a vested interest in rebuilding the Gulf Coast. You cannot have private money rebuilding roads and rebuilding infrastructure and hospitals and police stations and communications networks. That cannot happen and have it be workable in any viable form for the next generations. Certainly there will be private money, and there will be billions and billions in private money, and they will build houses, and they will build other housing, and they will build all the rest of the things that developers and private money can make money off of. But that is not, many believe, what the reconstruction of the Gulf Coast ought to be about. Sir?
Thanks for coming to Atlanta. Living in the suburbs, I definitely realize the high cost of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
When I was out in California, the first time our gas was here than it is now on the West Coast.
I saw that. It's great, isn't it? Sorry.
I was wondering if you could further comment on what you said about how the insight of what's happening to Delta and the high cost of fuels is really an indicator of how it's going to affect other areas and how that, go a little more into depth to that.
Sure.
The second thing is, here in the South, one of the problems that we're having that I have never experienced is that there really is a shortage of fuel. For the first time, the other day I need gas. I went to 5 gas stations before there was a gas station. Gas station had gas. And second, the price is, and, it's like you're spinning a wheel. You never know if it's from $2.50 to $3 and so forth. And that really is impacting on people's lives on limited budgets, and it just hasn't been much of a comparison. So if you could further comment.
You bet. That's actually an interesting anecdote. I had not heard anywhere other than during the coverage of the Rita evacuation of Houston of actual physical gas shortages. Raise your hand if you've pulled up at a gas station and haven't had any gas. No way.
They try to do things in order to prevent this, but it creates more of a hurry. The governor, he did last week, he canceled school for 2 days so that buses would not have to use diesel fuels. A lot of people say, or I have heard, that one of the reasons he did that is because of our soybean and peanut crop. They needed fuel for those trucks. They canceled school, but they created a fury because people, one, they said, what does the governor know, but we don't know, so the people there was Russian gas.
Sure.
And the second thing is you had other consequences where people had to buy daycare.
Yeah, oh yeah, you bet.
So they tried to find temporary solutions. And
Sure.
also we had a tax hold for last month, for a whole month where the state did not collect taxes in order to lower the price.
Right. That's actually very interesting, the shortages of gas and those kinds of things. And I think it's fair to say you'll be hearing that on Marketplace reasonably soon. Because, in California, you pull up a gas station, you get gas, and you pay $2.99 a gallon, and everything's groovy, because we all have to have our cars in L.A., To the first part of the question about the trickle-down effects, if I'm hearing you correctly, of high fuel prices. You guys all know the company Lazy Boy? Okay. 2 days ago, they came out and said, Hurricane Katrina is going to be affecting our quarterly profits and revenue forecasts. They make recliners. And they said, Hurricane Katrina. And so we sat there and we thought about it for a second. We're like, Lazy Boys and high oil prices. Well, what's inside a Lazy Boy? Foam and resins and all those sorts of things that are derived from petroleum products. There is not a doubt in my mind that the high impact of fuel prices, and Alan Greenspan can correct me if he thinks I'm wrong, but I venture to say that it will lead to price rises across the board. I think inflation is a very big problem. You saw the stock market yesterday, the Dow down 123 points because some Fed official kind of whispered, inflation. The people who run the economy in this country are very worried about rising prices. The Federal Reserve said at its last meeting when it raised interest rates for the 11th straight time, inflation is still a concern in this country. I think it is absolutely realistic to expect A, continued high gas prices, and B, rising prices across the board, airline tickets to Lazy Boys, because of what is happening with fuel prices. Thanks, Wilson, for your question.
Hi, my name is Randall Benson. I've got a long history with Asia, Asian studies, the Chinese.
Great.
Spent a lot of time
Yeah.
in Chinese society here. And
Yeah. course.
Throw a theory in front of you, see if you agree with me. Years ago, I heard that there were already more people in China making over $100,000 a year than here, which at first it was incredible, but then you think 105 people is Chinese. So
Right, there are 1.3 billion people there, so, right, right.
And as your show, I'm sure, is going to help people wake up if they haven't figured out already, China's the rising monolith that will come back to the beginning to where it ends, so to speak. And that's just a historical certainty. They always were. They just have a blip that drags
Sure.
it down for a short period of time, go back to where it used to be. My feeling is that it's very different from Japan Inc. The Chinese, the American business people who will soon start to get paranoid and scared about losing everything to outsourcing the Chinese imports really should take a look at the opportunities. Because the Chinese, again, unlike the Japanese, are more towards family businesses than mega corporations. Their biggest competitor is the guy across the street, not us. And that therefore there are huge opportunities for individual companies here to partner with individual companies there. Because the local here can be the marketing expert for this market. And
Sure. I don't disagree with your theory generally. I'll offer you this thought, though. When you do business in China, I had a very good friend when I was there who left the Foreign Service, stayed in China to do business, and got involved with a mall developer early on. This is 95, 96, 97, developing a shopping mall in Tianjin, maybe, which is an hour or so, a couple hours from Beijing. As with everything there, you have to have a Chinese partner when you do business. Everything was going fine. They built it. Everything was great. Literally, the day the mall was supposed to open, the Chinese partner would not give the keys to the mall, so to speak, the elevators and the locks and all this stuff, to the American corporation to open it up for business until there was some sort of fiduciary arrangement reached, shall we say. I think still, even today, it is a wild, wild west over there. McDonald's, one of the biggest companies on the planet, one of the best known, had the prime spot for a restaurant in China, right on the corner of Tiananmen Square, not far from Mao's tomb and the whole deal. They got moved because the Chinese government wanted to build a shopping street on Wangfujing Dade, if you know it. I think nobody is immune, but I think if you go in with your eyes open, then there is opportunity in China. That's undeniable, but there are concomitant risks.
Yeah, I also was amazed to see that in Southeast Asia, which, as you know, the business community is run by the overseas Chinese.
Sure.
Everyone in that got ripped off.
Yeah.
The Chinese ripped off, even the Chinese.
But, I mean, people get ripped off here, too. So, anyway, thanks, Randall, for your question. Sir?
Hi, Nancy Smith.
Yes.
You mentioned that Delta was the story of the day, and
Yeah.
I think it was maybe the story of the year.
Yeah. Well, Delta, the airlines writ large, but yeah.
Sort of curious what your take is on what the airlines or air service business looks like in a couple of years.
Oh, yeah.
As a result of all this going on.
Yeah, I think they look a lot like JetBlue and Southwest. I think the paradigm is changing. I was talking to Mickey Maynard, Micheline Maynard, who writes on transportation for the New York Times. We were having a conversation one day. And basically what we came to the conclusion of was that there will not be the full service, specifically domestic carriers, because airlines are going to have to cut their costs. People are not going to pay more than a couple of $300 or $400 to go someplace on an airline. I think this is quite conceivably the tipping point. When you have airlines voluntarily keeping planes on the ground because they lose less money than they do when they're in the air, I think they will recognize that something has to change. Now, it is not going to be easy. I mean, you saw Delta started some. They tried to do a low-cost carrier. It wasn't quite there because they didn't have the sort of corporate mindset that Southwest did and that JetBlue does. They're very good, and I've flown them, and I enjoy them. But it will take more than just saying, well, let's be a low-cost carrier to get it done. I think absolutely in 3 or 4 years it's going to be a low-cost, low-budget, bring your own food as it is now, with very, very tight profit margins. Yes, ma'am?
Good morning, Leanne Patterson. First of all, I wanted to tell you that you have one of the most soothing voices
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And two questions. Have you ever thought about doing a piece on the economic impact, the economic development impact that Africa has not only on the world but the U.S.? And secondly, have you ever thought about writing a book?
We do not have, as I think you could tell if you run down the list of our contributors and bureaus, we do not have anybody in Africa, and I think it's an oversight. I will tell you that when they started Marketplace, it was very much on a shoestring, and I think we are only now feeling our oats and becoming aware of our place in broadcast journalism. And I say that without any pejorative intent. It takes a long time to build the journalistic savoir-faire, to build the journalistic ethos in an organization where you begin to think of yourself as the program of record. I think it probably happened at the end of the Brancaccio years and through David Brown's years, and now will continue. So we are well aware, and we have contributors, and we do occasional stories. But you're right, our coverage is extremely underdeveloped in Africa. I'd love to write a book. Catch is with a full-time job and 3 little boys, it's kind of tricky. So if anybody has any good book ideas, drop me a line, and we'll talk, we'll collaborate.
I told someone else about it because I'm George Benson. I teach at People's Way Business School. The business that you brought up with Delta pensions.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It's a big story. It's not only Delta.
Oh.
The Pension Guarantee Corporation
You bet.
is bankrupt.
Let's tell folks what the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation is.
It basically established when the Ryssdal in 1974 was established. And at that time, most of the pensions were what's called defined benefit pensions, where you get based upon the last year's work and how many years you've had. A lot of people sort of define contribution and push over and then get it out. Well, basically, they guarantee these pensions for people up to a certain amount every year. And companies have not been putting the money into them that they should have over the years. They never altered. And nobody knows exactly what they ever had. Guarantee
Right.
corporation.
So that when a corporate pension is lacking, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, a government agency, takes over the responsibility for those pensions. It has happened with United Airlines. There was a story in the paper the other day in the New York Times about General Motors, which has 600,000 former workers, spouses, and family members for whom it is responsible under the terms of its pension plan. Short to the tune of $31 million, says the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. I'm sorry, I interrupted. So your question, sir.
It's quite not only them, but
Lots
lots of others.
of others, you bet.
And the big problem is who's going to pay the bill. Right now, that corporation is a private corporation. It's not the responsibility of the U.S.
That is correct.
But I did a lot of work on savings and loan prices at that time. The Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporations, the same way.
Yep.
And of course, all the depositors were bailed out. And it's very likely that taxpayers will pay this bill as well. What we don't recognize is how serious that bill is going to be. Because as people realize that the fees have to go up, they drop out, and get worse and worse. The second pension problem is government employees, cities, states, who have the same type of plan with no assets.
Right.
And there's a great temptation for government officials to promise something in the future because it was someone else's problem.
You bet.
And that's coming up. So I'm hoping that you would try to bring this out in your programs. It's very hard to describe. We only have a few minutes in each program. And over some time, as I said, I did a lot of work on savings and loan crisis, and it took a long time before it was recognized how bad it was. Those of us who worked in the area knew how bad it was back in the early 80s.
Yep.
And the stuff didn't hit the fan until a bit later.
No, I agree.
So that's right.
I completely agree with your point. We have done not a small amount of coverage on the pension problem. I will offer you only this mea culpa. If I say on the radio, Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, that sound you hear is radios turning off all over the country, right? Because, I mean, important as it is, and I understand that it's incumbent upon us to make this a more interesting conversation on the radio, but there are things that don't lend themselves to easy explanation. Believe you me when I say we are well aware of the pension problem marketplace, and we do have programs in the works. Yes, sir. Thank you.
and that Social Security, if it's a problem, Medicare is a train wreck, and the debt is absolutely a problem. They don't want to hear about people. They don't want to hear about trade deficits. I know that every generation has sort of the ego to believe that they're seeing things that are probably in a situation that no other generation has seen. But I do think that we are in an absolute place where individuals are spending too much, the government is spending too much. How do we get people interested? How do we, I know you want an audience. We are willing to provide services as an organization. How do we get people to come and listen? How do we get them to be proactive?
Obviously a much larger topic than we have time for here today. I'll offer you only this thought. There are times when I'm in a conversation at a cocktail party or one of the kids' soccer games or whatever, and somebody says, so what do you do? And I say, I host a public radio program on business and the economy. And they say to me, what's public radio? Stole my line, dude. Yeah, they say, what is public radio? And it happens all the time, so I shouldn't be surprised by it anymore, but I am. I think really it is only by a community effort. It's like that guy from Harvard who 5, 6, 8 years ago, whatever it was, wrote that paper on how America's on decline because we're not bowling anymore. His theory is that civic groups and community groups and activities aren't taking place these days because we're running the kids to soccer games, or both parents work, or somebody hits the microphone, something like that. I think it takes extra effort to make these sorts of things happen, and it is in my belief the people who listen to public radio and who read the newspapers to get out and have those conversations. And when somebody at the soccer game says to you, "What's public radio?" you tell them, and then you say, it's 90.1 on WABE. Did I get that right? I did. 90.1 WABE in Atlanta. Turn on the radio at 6:30, and I'll tell you about business and the economy. That's what you do. Hi, Pat.
Hi. Thanks for coming on, Pat Marcus with WABE.
Sure.
And as we were talking, I was thinking that the art of news is found just as much in the stories that you carry as in the stories that you don't carry. So I wanted to ask you to speak a bit about the stories you don't carry, Mark, as how you make those decisions. And I don't know about everybody else in this room, but I know when 7 o'clock comes, no matter what we're carrying on the WABE after that, I long for more marketplace. Have you ever thought about making a program now?
Again, it's Jay Yor at me. Call him and tell him you want more of Marketplace. I, too, have ambitions to take the program to an hour. There are a lot of programming problems with that. Marketplace fits very nicely in a whole lot of people's schedules because it is only a half an hour long. Excuse me. So I think that would be a tough sell, which is not to say that I won't continue to press it. That morning meeting I mentioned, every day at 8 o'clock, we go around the table for an hour, and we have a huge whiteboard behind us, and we fill it up in the course of an hour with all that stuff. And then the director of the program says, hey, that's great, there's like 15 stories up there we ought to do, but you guys have 6 minutes in the news hole. What are you going to figure out how to do? And I think the stories we are going to do, the stories we're not going to do, are the straight-ahead corporate stories. I'm not interested in a merger between United Healthcare and Umpty Frat's Hospital Association. I just couldn't care less, because you can read that in the New York Times, you can read that in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's not a story that people are going to get anything out of in terms of what it really means. I don't care about business. I care about the people who do business, and I care about how business affects people. We will not do a straight-ahead story on what Bill Gates said one day. We will not do a straight-ahead story on the Federal Reserve raising interest rates for the 11th time in a row. I mean, we know it's going to happen. You know, I could have told you yesterday what tomorrow's news is. I mean, that's not a big surprise. What we might do is a story on the prime rate, which now stands at 6.75% and rises with the Federal Reserve raising its short-term interest rates. And the reason I mention the prime rate is because a lot of people out there have home equity loans, and many of those home equity loans are tied to the prime rate, and the prime rate is a variable rate. My home equity loan is prime plus 0.25%, so 7% if I take it out my loan. 7% these days yeah, it's a pretty steep interest rate. And I don't really think that people understand what that means for them. So that's a story we might do instead of the Fed raised rates today for the 11th time in a row. Alan Greenspan at the end of the meeting said, you know, I mean, who cares?
I just wanted to slide another question.
Sure, of course.
It relates to what someone said earlier about how Americans might want to put blinders on in some
Yeah.
areas. Just driving around Atlanta and then having been in California and LA over the summer, I was struck by the difference in the number of SUVs, the type of cars. Do you think this time around there will be an impact on the vehicles that we're purchasing and what's happening with the SUV market?
You bet. A guy by the name of Dan Neal writes the car column for the Los Angeles Times. He won a Pulitzer Prize 2 years ago while working for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's the first car critic ever to win a Pulitzer Prize. You should go to latimes.com and read him. It's great stuff, not just car reviews, but some other stuff that he writes. He's been covering the car industry for 20 years. He's as insightful as anybody I know, and he believes that the worm has turned for Detroit. It's actually interesting because with lead times being what they are, you will see in the next 6 to 8 months some behemoths coming out of Detroit, some really giant SUVs that 5 will get you 10, will sit there on the lots until they have to give them away. Interestingly, that's the domestic manufacturers. The overseas manufacturers, even the overseas manufacturers that are owned by U.S. companies, places like Volvo and Jaguar, some of those are dealing with really small, the smart cars. You guys have seen the smart cars, are these little tiny, teeny things you see in Europe. They're coming here. Lots of other really small cars are coming here. It is absolutely true that just as with the airlines, I think the American automobile consumer will be thinking long and hard about that next purchase.
Hi, my name is Steve Schweinstein.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much.
There's a small window of opportunity in my listening day where I actually listen to commercial radio. I hope that's and one of the other notable things about Atlanta is we have a talk show host here who recently published a book on alternative tax systems in the United States. Given this little woman and all the things that she said is potentially wrong, and all the problems that we're doing, and all the issues in America today, it makes one want to consider maybe there are some larger solutions or larger issues that can be attacked, or at least for political reasons to start looking at some of these things. And I don't hear on Marketplace very often discussion of taxes or tax ramifications or the whole subject of taxes, because let's face it, that's the problem of our economy. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
You know, I can, but it's only with sort of a sense of embarrassment now that I think about it. Maybe you're right. We don't talk about taxes a whole lot, except maybe on the 14th of April. The president has a tax reform commission in the works, as you may or may not know, headed by John Breaux, former senator from Louisiana, and Connie Mack, former senator from Florida. Their recommendations are due to him the 1st of November. And there are a lot of things that are on the table. Taking care of the AMT, they're talking about a flat tax, they're talking about a whole lot of things. I think it is actually a very valid question and an excellent point and spotting of a weakness perhaps in Marketplace's coverage. There is no defense for that. It's enormously complicated, but enormously important. And everybody is interested. I mean, you know, we're all taxpayers. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. See, now I need to go back and look in the archives and see if we've done anything. Harry?
Harry Hassengable, WABE. We've spent a good deal of time, as many of the media have, on China. And I'm wondering how you see India fitting into the international economic picture, and what the chances are of Marketplace making a stop there.
I think chances are excellent. I think it'll be a while because China's going to knock it out of us. It's going to take all we have. We are a very small organization. I don't know how much you know about public radio, but we are lean. There is not a whole lot of money, and Marketplace is smaller than most. China will take it all out of us, and we'll have to regroup for a while before we go to India. I'll offer you this thought. 1 billion plus people, huge amounts of U.S. intellectual work being offshored and outsourced there, huge numbers of Indians here doing a lot of work. I think probably the second largest economic issue facing us is along those lines. I don't think it's at all untoward to be worried about that.
interestingly enough, the local Indian magazine Kebab this month has a look towards 2020, and it's got India outsourcing to the United States.
May well happen. It's a global economy, and I don't think we know what we don't know. Anybody else?
We'd like to encourage any of you. We would like to touch the ball. We have just a few more minutes before we would want to conclude this one.
Anybody?
In the chance that anyone might want to sort of encourage you to come up.
Don't be shy.
Want to go back to just one polite things up a bit. We've had
Sure.
your predecessor here.
Yes.
Here we go. And visualization in radio is work there. And I think some of you were at some of the events that we had with David Brown. And David, if you don't know, is a young man who rides a motorcycle and has long flowing hair, and as he spoke to us, he would frequently get his hair out of the way. And he talked to us about when he was on the air, about the way that he stood up and he presented the program standing because he felt that gave him more energy and that kind of thing. So could you talk to us about how you presented when you were
Sure.
on the
Sure. That's actually very interesting. First time I ever met David Brown, his hair was not down to here. It was down to here. Yeah, David's an interesting guy. Very, very talented radio person. He is now, by the way, for anybody of you who miss him, he is at KUT in Austin. His girlfriend, longtime girlfriend, lives there, and they decided that it was time to start living in the same city for a while. They're going to start a family, and David's doing some music programs at KUT in Austin. So I'm sure they're online if you want to hear more David Brown. I too stand up. I do it actually not because it gives me more energy. I think energy is important on the radio, but what is more important for me is a sense of comfort. So usually I'm wearing khakis and a polo. Sometimes I tuck it in, sometimes I don't. Now that I'm working days, I actually have to shave when I go to work. When I was working nights, I could get away without shaving. It is an extraordinarily interesting experience. To find yourself in front of a microphone talking to 5 million people a week, not trying to sound like you're talking to 5 million people a week. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, it takes a while to discover that the microphone is actually your friend and that you can talk to it instead of everybody who's out there and thinking and visualizing all those people. It is very much a collegial effort when I'm on the air. I depend very greatly on my director to keep me honest with the clock. We have extraordinary audio engineers at Marketplace who make the show sound good and who turn on my microphone when it's time for me to talk and who turn it off when it's time for me to stop talking. It is part of the reason I love radio is that it is a performance art. There is an element of myself that I get to share with you that hopefully comes through when you're driving home and stuck in traffic.
Sharon Goldwell from Canada.
Oh.
Since you were posting the forms
Yes.
both in Beijing and in Ottawa, just talk a little bit about the partnerships that could happen in the future. The facts are that Georgia is the number one trading partner is with Canada, so it's more of a partnership
Sure.
than competition. There's issues about energy. Canada provides is the number one energy provider to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
The healthcare industry actually is having a big impact now with the auto industry because the auto companies are relocating to Canada because they provide healthcare.
Right. The number one trading partner for this entire country actually is Canada. Some people think China, some people think Japan. It is actually Canada, the longest undefended border in the world, as I'm sure you know. I'll address just one of those topics that you mentioned, and that is energy, and specifically sand, the oil sands of Canada. It is extremely difficult and expensive to extract, but there are estimates there of billions and billions and billions of barrels of oil sitting underneath the Canadian sands. I think strategically it only makes sense that the United States join and explore and try to figure out a way to work with the Canadians. And it's really interesting because it is a close partnership, but it is at times very uneasy, perhaps because we take the Canadians for granted when they have something, energy, that we so desperately need.
Would you plan a marketplace visit to Canada?
Sure, but I'm only going in the summer. Coldest I've ever been with those 2 years in Ottawa, man. Oh my God. Yeah, well, that's right. That's right. Thank you, Sharon. Yes.
My name is Jennifer Conweiler, and I love your show.
Thank you.
We all need a little help along the way, and as you made your transition into radio and along the way, who have been some of your mentors, and who are some of the journalists today, either broadcaster or broadcasters or print media, who you admire?
John, how much time do we have? Do I have 5 minutes to tell a story? Okay. It is maybe instructive here to tell you how I got into public radio. Because clearly, if I've only been doing this for 7 years, I'm 41, I spent 30-something years doing something else. I spent 8 years in the United States Navy. I spent 4 years in the Foreign Service, as Leah mentioned. And when my wife and I were in Beijing at the end of our time in the Foreign Service, what turned out to be the end of our time in the Foreign Service, Stephanie wanted to go to graduate school, and I wanted not to be in the government anymore. By then it had been 12 or 13 years, and it was time for me to do something else. Steph applied to business programs, got accepted to the MBA program at Stanford. And I said, yeah, we're going to Palo Alto. And I figured, well, I'll get a job. I mean, this was 97, it's just the internet boom was just ramping up. And I'm like, I'll get a job at an internet company or selling computers or doing something. I don't care. I mean, they got to be hiring people. And, goodness knows I can't mess it up any more than it's already been messed up. And so we got to Palo Alto, and Steph started. This was May. We came back, we got married, and Stephanie spent the summer taking math courses to get ready for her MBA program. And I spent the summer kind of moping around, trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was 34 years old. And I took a job at Borders Books in Palo Alto on University Avenue, shelving books for $7.25 an hour. I will say that I started at $7 and they gave me a raise, because I was so good. And finally one day in August, right before school was going to start, and I had been moping around. It is a terrible, terrible thing to be 34 years old and have no earthly clue what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And finally Steph sat me down one day, and I remember it to this day. It was on a love seat in the back bedroom of this tiny little apartment. And she said, you really need to pull your head out of the dirt here, pal. And here's what I think you ought to do. I think you ought to try journalism. You are this weird news junkie who gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday to read the New York Times. You listen to NPR incessantly. You cannot get enough of the news. I think you ought to try it and get into it and see what happens. So I said, all right. So I tried, print, and that didn't work out, because the trick about print journalism is that you can't get into print journalism unless you've got clips, articles you've written for other publications. The problem is you can't get clips until you've written for other publications. So it's sort of a trick there. And then one day, late at night, at closing time at the bookstore, I was shelving books in the career and counseling section. Kid you not, putting them back on after the close. And I came upon a book of internships. And I was flipping through it, looking around, and right in the very back was public radio and journalism. And I found the name and the address of the senior editor at KQED News up in San Francisco, the public radio station there. And so I went home and I wrote him a letter, and I said, Dear Mr. Musiker, my name is Kai Ryssdal, I'm this and that, I'm interested in journalism, no experience, but I'm reasonably well educated, could we talk? And lo and behold, 2 days later, he gave me a call. And he said, sure, come on up, and we'll talk, and we'll see what happens. So I put on my very best State Department suit and tie, and I had my little briefcase, and I took the train up to San Francisco, and I walked into the station. And of course, if anybody's ever been in a public radio station, you know that suits and ties are not something you see on the reporters and the managers. And there are people in jeans and T-shirts, and there's bagels all over the table, and it's sloppy, messy, and that's just the way journalism is, because there's a lot going on. And Cyrus Musiker and I sat down and we chatted, and he said, listen, obviously I can't give you a job, but why don't you come and intern for us a couple of days a week, and we'll see what happens. And I said, absolutely. So I cut back my hours at Borders, and I went to the radio station on Tuesdays and Thursdays, took the train up, and I did all the stuff that the other 19-year-old interns were doing. I learned how to, this was back in the day when we still had, actual tape recorders and, razor blades and splicing tape and all that stuff. And I learned how to cut tape, and I learned how to use a tape recorder, and I went out and I got sound from press conferences for the real reporters. And I would come back and I would put that together, and I would write a little copy up top, and I'd have a piece of tape in there, and then I'd write some copy on the way home, and I would be taking the train home and listening on my Walkman to the afternoon news anchor, and I'd hear my thing, and I'd say, that is the coolest thing in the universe. I just got on the radio. So I hung around KQED for a while and doing my internship for a couple of months, and then they said, listen, we need a morning news producer. Can you get here at 5 in the morning and help the morning anchor do wire copy and write scripts and do interviews and cut some tape. And I said, yeah, sure, I can do this. So that worked out for a couple of months, and then eventually they let me do that, produce shows on a full-time basis. And then finally, after a year and a half, they finally let me report a story on my own. They were paying me a day rate, so it was literally day-to-day. That turned into a 6-month personal contract that I had, which turned into a year-long contract, which turned into my disastrous episode on the afternoon news that first time, after about a year and a half. They let me then sort of graduate to the morning show, and I did the morning news. And then finally, finally I wound up substitute hosting the California Report, which is their statewide broadcast. And somebody down in LA at Marketplace heard me and said, listen, we've got this morning host job, why don't you come down and talk to us? And I said, yeah, I really can't, because we're about to have our baby. Our second child was due in 10 days, and thanks very much, but I can't. And I hung up the phone. And my wife and I were talking about it that night, and we said, you know what, Marketplace really only calls one time, and you need to answer the phone. So I called Emily Donahue back, the producer of the morning program, and I said, listen, let me come down for just a couple of days with the understanding that if my wife goes through labor, I'm really going to have to go. I went down, it worked out, obviously, and then in July of 2001, I started doing the overnights at Marketplace. And that is a very long way to tell you that I am nobody's example of how to get into journalism. So if you're looking for a career in journalism and public radio, don't follow me. You asked who I look to, and I will tell you this. I look to a lot of people. I look to everybody, because there's nothing that any of us can't learn by looking at a whole bunch of different people. But I will tell you this. Everything I know in journalism has its roots in actually getting out and doing it. You have to go out and get the story. You have to go out and get a story wrong and feel that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you hear this thing on the radio that turns out to be wrong. Worst feeling in the world. And then having to go on the air the next day and fix it. You have to get it right. Everything that I bring to the table today at Marketplace started in those first couple of months, riding the train home and hearing that thing on the radio in the afternoon on KQED saying, wow, that's radio. And that's that story. Thank you, John. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.